For 2021, Audi has given their popular Q5 crossover a refresh. We get sharper looks inside and outside, updated infotainment and electronic systems on the inside, a bit more performance depending on the trim and the engine selection that you're looking at. And today, I'm driving the new plug-in hybrid version. Although I'm filming this vehicle in my usual location, I've only had a short amount of time with this Q5. This is technically a launch event, although thanks to the ongoing global pandemic, I haven't flown somewhere. Instead, Audi has sent the car to me. Although I am going to touch on pricing a little bit later in the video, if you want my full pricing and comparison section, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there and come back when I can get my hands on one of these for a full week. Hopefully I'll be able to get my hands on the updated SQ5 as well, because Audi has promised that that model is going to have significantly better performance. Up front we have full LED headlights with LED turn signals. You can see that that white accent strip turns into the turn signal. No fog lights below. Instead, Audi uses what they call all-weather lights. They project light mainly to the side of the vehicle, but that lamp is actually included right here in the headlamp housing itself. Although the styling of the Q5 has morphed over time, it is still instantly recognizable as a Q5 and instantly recognizable as an Audi. In case you're wondering, yes, the Q5 can get Audi's fancy matrix LED headlights. Rather unfortunately, they can't do all the fun things that they can do in Europe because America's lighting laws are honestly prehistoric. Until those lighting laws change in the US, you're not going to see too much of a difference between the average LED headlight out there and some of the matrix or laser headlights that we see from a lot of the European car companies. For this model year, Audi is including more of their active safety systems and driver assistance technologies standard on every Q5. But you will notice that we don't get the same level of standard equipment that we do find in some of the luxury brands from Asia, specifically Genesis and Lexus. They typically will have a few more features standard, like adaptive cruise control, something that is still optional on the Q5. At 183.6 inches long, the Q5 is pretty firmly in the middle of the compact luxury crossover segment. In this particular segment, we don't see as much size variation as we see in the mainstream compact segment. So whether you're taking a look at this, or an X3, or a GLC, or an XC60, or an Infiniti QX50, they're all going to be relatively similar in terms of size. Now the layout of the vehicles does change a bit, so if you take a look at something like an Audi RDX, it has a slightly shorter trunk and a little bit more interior room, but on the outside they're all going to be very similarly sized. Moving towards the rear, you'll notice that we have a rear hatch that's a bit more raked than we find in some of the competition. That does reduce cargo practicality just a little bit in the Q5. As with the rest of the Audi lineup, the best way to describe the Q5's design is restrained and elegant. Audi tends not to go for things that are overly controversial in terms of their design. We have full LED tail lamp modules with red turn signals, not amber turn signals rather unfortunately, but they are progressive, which does give this a nice touch. And you'll notice that we have two sets of tail lamp modules, one here on the hatch and then one down here on the bumper. That's because this hatch wraps completely from one side of the vehicle all the way to the other and includes those tail light modules, rather than most of the competition where the tail lamps stay fixed into place and then the hatch moves around them. If I open the hatch, you'll see why we have this double set of lamps down below. According to headlight and tail light lighting laws, you have to have lights that are fixed on the vehicle. So since those move on the hatch, they have a duplicate set down here that turns on when the hatch is open. This is also where we find the backup lights. At the very bottom of the bumper, we continue to see Audi's faux exhaust tips. The real exhaust tips are wrapped up under the bumper. On our side of the pond, the Q5 is going to come with three different drivetrains. The standard one is a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, producing 261 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque. Making this different than most of the European competition, the standard transmission is a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, not a traditional automatic transmission. And all-wheel drive is standard across the Q5 lineup. That's something that you have to pay for in most of the competition. So when you're taking a look at the Q5 and comparing this with its direct competitors, whether you're talking about entries like the Lexus or the Genesis, or any of the competition from Japan, keep the standard all-wheel drive system in mind. The Q5 I was most interested to drive, however, is the one that I was able to get my hands on. This is the new plug-in hybrid Q5. This sits in the middle of the engine lineup, and it bumps things up to 362 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque by taking basically that same base drivetrain and adding an electric motor between the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission and the 2-liter turbocharged engine. So this uses basically the same transmission that we find in the base model and basically the same engine, but we get 100 more horsepower out of this. The extra shove is courtesy of a 14.1 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack that's located in the rear of the vehicle that also helps give this a slightly better weight balance than we find in the base model. According to Audi and the EPA, the combination is good for 19 miles of EV driving at speeds of up to 85 miles an hour. after which this will default to a regular hybrid and give you 27 miles per gallon combined. Those numbers are essentially identical to what we see in the Volvo XC60 T8. That gives you a little bit more horsepower, 400 horsepower, a whole lot more torque than this, but a very different kind of hybrid design that we'll talk about in a bit. Versus the X3 plug-in, the Q5 will give you more range and better fuel economy once the battery is exhausted. Versus the Mercedes GLC, we get a little bit less range, but a reasonable bump in terms of fuel efficiency once the battery is depleted. If you're looking for the fastest Q5 available, that would be the SQ5, even though it produces a little bit less power than we find out of this system. 349 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque out of a 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder engine. That swaps out the 7-speed DCT for an 8-speed automatic transmission, but all-wheel drive is still standard. According to Audi, for 2021, the SQ5 is 0.4 of a second faster than the 2020 model. That's a pretty significant bump. Rather unfortunately, I haven't been able to test that one just yet. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into the hybrid system. At a really high level, the theory of operation in this system is essentially the same as the one that we find in the X3 and the GLC plug-in hybrid. We have a regular engine up front, and then after that we have the same transmission and drivetrain that we find in the regular Q5. But in between, they've sandwiched an electric motor. Things are pretty different in the Volvo XC60 T8 because it has a front-wheel drive transmission to start with. It also has a turbocharged and supercharged engine rather than simply a turbocharged engine. And then there is no mechanical connection between the front wheels and the rear wheels in the XC60 T8. They simply stick an electric motor in the rear, and then the regular drivetrain from the front-wheel drive model, essentially with some extra electric motors, goes up front. This is quite different. So if you're looking for something with more sure-footed feel in terms of slippery weather, gravel roads, snowy roads, ice, that sort of thing, you're going to want to take a look at a mechanical all-wheel drive system in a plug-in hybrid like this, like the X3 and the GLC. On the other hand, the traditional transmissions and the mechanical all-wheel drive systems are likely the reason that any of the German options are not going to give you the same level of efficiency that you'd see in something like the RAV4 Prime. Unlike some of Audi's other vehicles with plugs, everything happens out back. Behind door number 1 on the passenger side, we find the fuel filler. And behind door number 2 on the driver's side, we find a standard J1772 charging port. If you have access to a level 2 EVSE that's able to deliver enough power, you will be able to take this vehicle from 0 to completely full in just under 2.5 hours. We don't have a DC fast charge connector because, of course, this is a plug-in hybrid. Over here on this side, we have some really nice touches. We have a button to start the charge process and a button to start the charge timer, along with a little LED indicator for the status of the charge. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 8 out of 10 points. Remember, I'm not in the top end trim, so you do find different seats if you work your way on up the trim ladder. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, 2-position driver memory over there on the driver's door, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, which is a nice touch. You don't find that in all of the competition for some reason, and a front passenger seat with the same range of motion as the driver's seat. Hopping into the back seat and sitting behind this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have a reasonable amount of room back here. I have about 3 inches of legroom left. There's a little bit less room in here than we find in the Volvo XC60 and a few inches less than we find in the Acura RDX. The RDX is really large on the inside, but we do find a bit more room in here in terms of rear seat room than the X3 or Stelvio. Remember, of course, that this is still a compact luxury crossover. So if you want something roomier, you're going to want to take a look at something like the Audi Q8. It still has 2 rows, but it's a decent amount bigger than this. Moving over here to the middle seat, I still have a generous amount of headroom, about 1 inch left. This model does have the large panoramic moonroof. If I scoot all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, you notice that the footwell is starting to feel a little bit constrained there. That's because this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. And in this position, I have about 1/4 inch of legroom left. Most compact luxury crossovers are going to have a little bit of trouble with a taller adult up front and a rear-facing child seat behind. There are a few exceptions to that, like the Acura RDX. The Volvo XC60 is a little bit closer to this, but generally speaking, most of the vehicles that the Audi Q5 are going to compete with are going to have very similarly sized back seats. At 25.1 cubic feet, the cargo capacity of the Q5 is sort of middle of the pack. That's likely due to this more raked profile than we see in some of the competition. But Audi does sort of dish out the cargo hatch a little bit, so it is a tiny bit squarer than this side profile might indicate, but still not quite as large as some of the competitors. Because Audi has located the 14.1 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack underneath the cargo load floor, we don't find room for a spare tire or any additional storage area. The floor does not lift up at all, but it does help balance the weight in the Q5 a little bit more than we find in the regular version. In case you're wondering, there is a tow hook. It's located behind a little door right there in the load floor. The rear seats can be folded via a lever on the side of the seat or a lever right back here in the cargo area. And Audi continues to give us a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. This is a lot more practical than a 60-40 design because you could put larger items like skis or snowboards right here inside the vehicle. That gives you a great deal more cargo practicality than a simple ski pass-through, and it allows you to carry that cargo item while still seating 4. As we look around the interior, you should know that we are not in the absolute top-end trim of the Q5. So obviously there are going to be a few things that you'll find in that very top-end trim, like an available heads-up display, etc., that are not in the model that we're taking a look at today. However, we do have a very large panoramic moonroof. It goes to just over the rear passengers' heads. Audi has a number of different upholstery options depending on the trim level you're looking at. Most of the models of Q5 won't have terribly aggressive bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushion, so you should be just fine for larger folks. Although Audi has expanded their color palette in recent years, it seems like most of the models you'll find on dealer lots tend to be very monochromatic. That's a matter of personal preference. Personally, I like an interior that's a little bit lighter. Audi tends to favor really darker interior colors. We have some really attractive wood trim going on here on the door, a lot of soft touch and premium materials, and tons of speakers littered throughout this interior. This has one of the up-level audio systems, so we have a speaker right there by that door lock switch, one right there in front of the window switch, one down there at the bottom. Then there are also speakers in the dashboard and speakers going up the A-pillar as well. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a soft touch upper injection molded section, more of that real wood trim going on there. There are a number of different trim options, little Quattro badge there. And then you can see that we have a fairly large bin style glove compartment. I had no problem fitting a larger tablet computer inside. Nestled in the middle of the dashboard, we have a standard 10.1 inch color touchscreen infotainment system. This is running the latest version of Audi's MMI software. If you're seeing a little bit of flickering on your screen, it's just due to the way this system's refresh rate interacts with the refresh rate of my camera, so it doesn't flicker in person. As you can see, this system supports smartphone integration, but it doesn't occupy the entire screen. There are certain options that are reserved for the sides of the screen and the top of the screen as well. So you can see we have the car's built-in LTE modem right there. It also has a pull-down menu right there from the top. If I go back to the CarPlay interface, you can see what that looks like. You can just pull that down right there. That gives you direct access to turn the screen off, to go home, turn on the ionization mode. We don't have the ignition on in the car right now. Adjust settings like the sound settings. I can just click that option to get over there to sound settings. The fixed options on the left side of the screen are mainly self-explanatory. We can click the home button and get to our main menu where we have a bunch of different options there. I can click it again and get sort of a overview of things. So audio, time, and then our search panel right there. You can swipe side to side to go through all those various options, or click the home button to get right back to the screen you're interested in. The radio button logically takes you over to the radio interface, the media to the media interface. It doesn't directly take you over to CarPlay. Instead, it takes you to the Audi interface for whatever media source you're listening to, so you can have that choice. There's a phone interface. Of course, it's not available because I'm right there in Apple CarPlay, and I can click over to the navigation interface to get the Google satellite image view that Audi MMI has become known for. This system is much snappier than previous versions of the Audi MMI system. As you can see there, it supports pinch to zoom and swipe around gestures. You notice that this sort of amoeba-looking thing that looks like it swallowed part of the Santa Cruz Mountains, that's the EV drive distance. The battery right now is about half charged, so that shows you approximately the distance that you could go with that half-charged battery. Now, if you don't continue the subscription for this system, then the Google satellite imagery does disappear. And then if I click this little icon right here and go into map settings, you can see what that would look like. If I simply turn off the satellite map, with the satellite imagery off, this looks very much like every other nav system out there, and it will also disable the satellite imagery on the digital cockpit display behind the steering wheel. Moving down the dashboard, we find two large air vents, the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system. This is also where we find the buttons for the heated seats, ventilated seats if you had that particular option. There's an Audi drive mode selector button there, and then a button to change the EV drive mode. If I press this drive mode button and then take a look back at the infotainment screen, you can see the three drive modes. We can choose electric mode, auto hybrid, or battery hold mode. There's also a button to enable and disable the parking sensors, a very small storage area. It's not quite deep enough to store some of those larger smartphones, and that's one of my complaints about this particular dashboard design, is that there's not a lot of places to put things like smartphones. We have a small area right there where you definitely couldn't put a smartphone, and then we have a small slot here where you can't put any of those larger smartphones. The shifter is a joystick-style console shifter. I pull all the way back when pressing this button to give us drive, toggle once more for sport mode, push it over to the right for the manual transmission mode, and then I press that P button for park mode. Behind that, we have the electric parking brake, and then over on this side, we find the track forward, backward, and volume knob for the infotainment system. My one complaint about that power and volume knob is that I do have a number of passengers that for some reason love to put their leg pretty far over the center console, and they do end up bopping that knob while you're driving down the road. Between the front seats, we find a ratchet-style center armrest. It's softly padded. You can also lift it up out of the way. That gives us access to the Qi wireless charging mat that slides on this little lid here, and then we have two cup holders in front of it. Now, this does not open up. It just slides forward and backward right like that. over a small storage area behind. So I suppose you could put your smartphones in there, but larger smartphones like that won't fit with the cord connected. Now this infotainment system does support wireless smartphone integration, but if you prefer to use a cord, this could be a bit of a problem. There's also an additional USB input back there. Now if this is slid back there and you're using those cup holders, then there is some storage room available underneath that, but it is harder to get to those items. And now to this interior's party piece, the updated Audi virtual cockpit. The display is controlled via the buttons and knob on the left side of the steering wheel. We have a menu option, back option, toggle buttons right there, and then a view button. The display is highly configurable. If you'd rather have a tachometer on the left, you can do that. If you'd rather have a power meter on the left, you can do that as well. And then you can choose a combined power meter and tachometer with a little digital tachometer down there at the bottom. In the reduced view, you can also choose what you want flagged right there on top of that tachometer, whether you want that to be the fill level, the fuel consumption, electrical consumption, average speed, or just nothing at all. With this generation of the virtual cockpit, Audi has deleted the little LED banks that we found on the sides of the previous generation display, so there's no separate fuel level other than the ones that you'll see on the screen depending on the different views that you're in. Obviously, the most attractive of these is this Google satellite imagery view. It is really, really cool. Again, we have that little curtain line there in the 3D mode. You can barely see it to show you where your EV mode would end if you're in that EV drive mode. The display can also give you album information from the source of music that you're playing, and obviously that all works in all these various different display modes. We have a bunch of different vehicle displays like range, consumption, fuel economy, that kind of stuff, driver assistance, traffic sign readouts if you have that particular option. And then we of course go back to that large display. The steering wheel is a round design with fairly narrow side spokes and a split bottom spoke. There's sport grips up top, and this one's leather wrapped. We have paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel, down on the left and up on the right. On the left side of the wheel, we have those controls I showed you earlier. Those control that multifunction LCD instrument cluster. On the right side, we have some infotainment controls and a button for the heated steering wheel. You don't find cruise control buttons on here because instead those are located on a stalk to the left of the steering wheel and a little bit below. Thanks to the tweaks that Audi has done under the hood, performance is up basically across the line in the Q5. If you get the base Q5 model, it'll go 0 to 60 in about 5.7 seconds. That's about a quarter second faster than last year's model. If you get this plug-in hybrid version, this will go 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, even according to Audi. Unfortunately, I have not been able to test this, but that number seems perfectly valid. If you get the SQ5, they've made some tweaks to that model that will get it 0 to 60 nearly a half second faster than before. That should bring it down to about 4.7 seconds. One of the reasons I haven't been able to test this Q5 just yet is that it has been absolutely pouring out here for the last few days. The roads are very, very wet. So in my preliminary 0 to 60 test, this came in right at 5 seconds. I don't know if that would improve if the road was a little bit drier, but I suspect that the braking distance I achieved, which was 122 feet, would improve if the road surface was drier. This model has 255 width tires on it. There are a variety of different tire sizes available in the Q5, but generally speaking, these tires are going to be a lot wider than your average mainstream plug-in vehicle. So if you're comparing this to something like that new RAV4 Prime that seems to be sucking all the air out of the room, keep the tire size in mind. That's another reason that this does not get the same kind of fuel economy numbers that we see out of that Toyota plug-in. Obviously, this is also going to be faster and more powerful than the Toyota plug-in. It has a real mechanical all-wheel drive system, etc. But for some reason, I've received a reasonable number of questions asking me to compare this with that particular Toyota model. I really just don't see that they compare. And that's not just because one has a Toyota logo on the front and this one has an Audi logo on the front. It has to do with the way this vehicle feels and the way that this vehicle drives. This drives like the rest of the luxury car competition, which is to say, definitely a step above what we see in the RAV4. Of course, if you want the maximum amount of fun in a crossover in this segment, then you're probably going to want to take a look at base versions of the Mercedes-Benz GLC. It's rear-wheel drive, it has a great weight balance. Also, the Alfa Romeo Stelvio is a ton of fun. On the other hand, the all-wheel drive system that's standard in the Q5 means that this can apply all that power. You can just floor it around corners like that. Absolutely no fuss, no muss, no wheel spin or anything like that. And again, Audi's Quattro all-wheel drive system is standard on all Q5 models, not just this plug-in hybrid trim. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I got 71 decibels in this cabin. That's pretty similar to a wide variety of the competition that uses similar tires. This model has 255 width tires on it, so logically you should expect a little bit more road noise than something like a base Lexus NX, which is going to have much narrower tires on it. Speaking of that Lexus NX, obviously you could compare this to a regular hybrid like the Lexus NX Hybrid. This is going to be significantly more powerful, significantly faster than the Lexus NX Hybrid, and surprisingly enough, the fuel economy is not too far off, even though this has a significant amount more power and of course the electric range. Bear in mind that although the NX Hybrid is related to a RAV4, it is not related to the current generation RAV4, and that's the big reason that its fuel economy is not up closer to 40 miles per gallon. It's an awful lot closer to the 27 miles per gallon average that this vehicle is EPA rated for. And over a day of mixed driving, I've had no problem achieving 27 mpg. In fact, I've actually been getting a little bit better than that. When operating this just as a hybrid with the battery completely depleted, I was actually averaging 30 miles per gallon while going up and over the 2,200-foot mountain pass that I drive every day. When in electric mode, I was able to get about 22 miles of range just sticking around town, driving at lower speeds, up to about 50 miles an hour on some of the expressways in this area. But at higher highway speeds, you're definitely going to be getting closer to 17 or 18 miles. In terms of EV efficiency, this is never going to be as efficient as a full EV because the motor is always driving the wheels through the 7-speed dual clutch transmission and then through a mechanical all-wheel drive system. And there's simply more mechanical loss involved in that. That's why we get a 50 mpge score in this vehicle rather than over 100 mpge in many full EVs out there. One thing that surprised me, however, is that the MPGE score does appear to have dropped versus last year. I'm not sure if that's due to a revised calculation on behalf of Audi, or perhaps they've decided to be ultra conservative with the fuel economy numbers on this particular vehicle. One thing's for certain, however, not all 14.1 kilowatt hours of the battery pack are available to you as the driver. Audi does reserve a portion of the battery in order to help improve battery pack lifetime. That's something that we see in a wide variety of EVs and plug-in hybrids out there. A nice touch that we don't see in all EVs and plug-in hybrids out there, however, is that this has a heat pump system. And I was really intrigued by that because not too many plug-in hybrids have one, and honestly, not too many full EVs have one either. The Model Y and now the Model 3 are the first Teslas to get a full heat pump system, and this plug-in hybrid has one. That's really going to reduce your energy consumption in colder weather, and it's going to allow this vehicle to stay with the engine off as long as possible. Now, logically, the kind of shopper that would be interested in this is someone that really wants the safety net of the gasoline engine. They don't want to go cold turkey, if you will. They want to mitigate their gasoline consumption, but they don't want to eliminate it. And that's certainly what's going to happen in this vehicle. If you have a commute over 20 miles, say, you're certainly going to be burning some gasoline every day. However, if you have the ability to charge this on either end of that longer commute, you will certainly be using an awful lot less gasoline than you would if you had the regular model. And unlike some plug-in hybrids out there, but a little bit more like that Volvo XC60 T8, the fuel economy when operating purely as a hybrid is definitely good. 27 to 30 miles per gallon over a day of mixed driving is certainly above the base 2-liter engines that we find in any of the non-hybrid options out there. And even though you're lugging around a bigger battery, again, it's really similar to the Lexus NX Hybrid. One of the likely reasons for that on my daily commute is the mountainous nature of my commute. This has a greater ability to regenerate energy into the battery because it has a bigger capacity battery, so that way when you're going downhill, more energy can be recaptured. That's normally going to be wasted in a lot of regular hybrids because their batteries just aren't big enough. The feel of this DCT is one reason that you might want to upgrade from the base Q5 up into the plug-in hybrid model, because all dual clutch transmissions are generally speaking going to be a little less smooth than a traditional automatic transmission, with the exception, I think, of this particular transmission. You have the swiftness of shifts of a dual clutch transmission, you have that urgency when the engine is definitely online, and then honestly, at low speed maneuvers, you really couldn't tell the difference between this and a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission. Bear in mind, of course, this is still a hybrid. So there are going to be situations where you're going from pure EV mode to hybrid mode where there's going to be a little bit of delay. So I floored it there and then we get some power. Or situations where there's a slightly harsher gear engagement than you'd find out of a traditional automatic transmission. But they seem to be few and far between. But again, what I find most impressive are the low speed starts and stops in the system. Just coasting right here from a stop, letting the motor just start you up there. It's very, very smooth. Again, a lot smoother than the competition. The other thing I noticed about this hybrid system is the braking feel. Regen braking is pretty aggressive. You can get up to 80 kilowatts of regeneration ability. And even though the power is flowing through the transmission, it has to go from the wheels through the transmission to the electric motor, the braking feel is very, very consistent. I think that all has to do with the dual clutch rapid shifting nature of this transmission. The transmission can just stay in the right gear for braking longer than you could with the traditional automatic transmission. And then if you were to suddenly rocket off into the distance immediately after that braking maneuver, the transmission shifts rapidly enough that that's not a problem. If you want to get your hands on the new Q5, these should be on dealer lots right around the time that you're watching this video. When you take a look at the pricing chart on the side of your screen, keep in mind that the Q5 comes standard with all-wheel drive. That's a feature that's optional on the vast majority of its competition. At the moment, the Q5 is going to come in 3 different trims. Pardon me for my notes here. I haven't had time to memorize everything here just yet. The base model is going to be $43,300, and that is going to give you the standard large MMI system that we find in the dashboard, but not the digital instrument cluster, or at least not the same digital instrument cluster that you saw in this model. You're going to get a smaller 7-inch screen in the driver's side. If you want the plug-in hybrid version of the Q5, you will be able to find that in the base trim for just under $52,000. Again, the plug-in hybrid is the model that I've been driving today. That's probably a really good deal in the Audi lineup, because not only do we get more power, we get the electric drive mode, but we also get a large federal tax credit that's really going to drop the effective price of that versus the rest of the Q5 lineup. Now, it's still not going to be as inexpensive as the absolute base trim of the Q5, but it is going to really narrow that delta more than you might think. The Premium Plus trim for $48,100 is where you find features like the Audi virtual cockpit that this model had on it. And if you step up to $54,000, the Prestige model is going to give you the top-end audio system as well as the Matrix LED headlights. If you're looking for a modern luxury crossover with the latest tech inside, you should definitely put the Q5 on your shopping list. The Audi virtual cockpit really is an impressive piece of technology. I love the way that Audi's designed not just the hardware, but most importantly the software and the visual interface in that virtual cockpit. They've also given the system a very fast processor, so it doesn't feel laggy like some of the competitive LCDs do. Large LCD instrument clusters aren't exactly rare, and you will see some of the competition with a bit more screen real estate because they have LCD instrument clusters that are very horizontal, very squared edges, etc., that give you more square inches of LCD, but they're not going to be as attractive or as snappy as the one that we find in the Audi. Audi's inclusion of satellite imagery has always set the virtual cockpit apart from the competition, and with the plug-in hybrid model, they give you a really cool little line to tell you where your EV range will end. You should know that modern Audis do require a continuing subscription in order to maintain that satellite imagery in the MMI system or in the virtual cockpit after the particular trial period has ended, so keep that in mind. Personally, that's something that I would pay for because it does look really, really cool in any modern Audi. If that subscription ends, then it does look more like a traditional mapping interface that you'd find in most of the competition. But the system will still be snappier, and I think the graphics are better designed than in the GLC or the X3 or the Volvo XC60. And certainly snazzier than the competition that simply does not offer a full LCD, and there are a decent number of those even in this luxury segment. Then we have Audi's relatively new and certainly impressive plug-in hybrid system. Even though this uses a traditional mechanical all-wheel drive system, it's just as efficient as the all-wheel drive system that we find in the XC60. That gives you greater sure-footedness and greater traction in adverse weather situations versus the all-wheel drive system that we see in that Swedish model. I personally like the interior design of the Volvo a little bit more than what we see in this Audi. It also has a slightly larger cargo area and a little bit more passenger room, but the gadgets and gizmos in this Audi are definitely very impressive. And again, the all-wheel drive system is certainly better than what we see in that Volvo at the moment. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and stay tuned because hopefully I'll be able to get my hands on another Audi Q5, hopefully the base model or the SQ5 very, very soon to run it through our usual battery of comparisons and tests, so be sure and stay tuned for that. In the meantime, be sure and head over to facebook.com/AlexNautos, Twitter, Instagram, all those other social places, and of course, be sure to check out the merch store over at AOAmerch.com. I'll see all of you later.